Charles Manson sits cross-legged on a prison floor, eyes closed in meditation. The man who orchestrated one of America's most infamous killing sprees is teaching fellow inmates about environmental awareness and quoting Buddhist texts. Guards walk by without concern. In the visiting area, young women wait anxiously, not to condemn him, but to receive spiritual guidance. It's 1980, a decade after the Tate LaBianca murders, and Manson isn't just surviving prison, he's thriving as a spiritual mentor. The monster America created to embody its darkest fears has transformed into something even more disturbing. A guru who never actually killed anyone himself. The truth about Charles Manson isn't found in horror stories or true crime documentaries, but in how perfectly he reflected the society that needed a demon to burn. You felt the jolt of that opening, the absurd image of the country's ultimate bogeyman as a meditating mentor. That image rarely fits the neat lesson most people learned in school, on true crime TV, or in the glossy retellings that populate streaming platforms. Now, let's step back and rehearse that polished story everyone knows. The version the camera's trained on. The version that made Manson into a symbol tidy enough to store on a bookshelf. The official narrative is clean, muscular, and built to reassure. It begins with a familiar scene. A short, wild-eyed man with a crooked smile and a charisma like a switch. Charles Manson, failed musician, petty criminal, the charismatic leader of a group of otherwise innocent, impressionable youth called the Family. In this telling, Manson's life arcs in a straight horror line. Rejection by the music industry, cultivation of a cult of personality on Spawn Ranch, and a carefully plotted descent into murder intended to ignite Helter Skelter, an apocalyptic race war he allegedly derived from scrambled Beatles lyrics. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi supplies the script. Manson is the puppeteer, the followers are helpless marionettes, and the murders at Cielo Drive and LaBianca are the grotesque climax of a single, coherent plan. Hear the official voices. A textbook voice in tones. He brainwashed bright young women and sent them out to kill. A documentary narrator in tones with clipped certainty. Manson wanted to start a race war. The killings were the first fires. A prosecutor, speaking into the camera, seals the impression. He didn't need to be there, his mind was the weapon. These are short, confident statements. They sound like answers. They sound like closure. The version is cinematic by design. It gives us a villain whose evil is absolute. It has neat villains and victims, motive and method, a villain who is easier to detest than to understand. It does heavy lifting. It suits a shocked public by locating violence in a single pathological individual instead of a network of failed institutions. It reassures. The system works, mystery solved, monster jailed. You watched it in clips and rewindable soundbites. You repeat it in coffee shops. Manson brainwashed them. The story is economical. It answers a complicated moral panic with a simple explanation. But notice the features that make the story useful. It simplifies cause and consequence. It rewards prosecutors and journalists with headlines. It sells books, films, and sensational specials. It also performs an ideological job. By making Manson uniquely evil, it spares the nation an uncomfortable look in the mirror. Institutions are spared detailed blame. The entertainment industry, which flirted with him and his followers, is absolved. The juvenile system that formed him is allowed to stay in the background. Listen to how the official script organizes its evidence. Motive is neat because motive decorates intention. Helter Skelter is seductive as an explanation because it wraps racial tension, pop culture obsession, and apocalypse into a single phrase. The Family are easy to depict as brainwashed because that word provides moral clarity. The prosecution's narrative gains emotional gravity the same way a well-scored film does. Music swells where doubts should remain. That ease is the story's greatest virtue and its deadliest flaw. For the public, the official narrative answers too well. It fills gaps with tidy suppositions and then refits memory around the fill. Over the decades, this version ossified. The book that did the most to fix it, the prosecutor's best-selling account, read like courtroom theater. It sold millions and cemented the image of Manson as a kind of satanic Pied Piper. Film and television loved it because it produced unmistakable visuals. The wild-eyed leader at the center of a ring of hypnotized youths. Blood, symbols, and courtroom spectacle. It required little historical nuance and demanded no institutional reckoning. Now, to understand just how constructed this version is, we need to mark where it borrowed, where it invented, and where it simply left things out. First, the borrowing. The failed musician angle is half true. Manson tried to break into the music business. He met people on the margins of Hollywood. Religious language and apocalyptic rhetoric did swirl in his circle. But the official frame grafts these facts into a single linear motive, and in that grafting it trims away inconvenient details. Second, the invention. The neatness of Helter Skelter as the overarching cause was less Manson's confession than a prosecutorial tool. It functioned to explain how a man who was not at the scene could nonetheless be the moral and legal author of the crimes. The narrative of total, almost supernatural control was useful for the prosecution if you can persuade a jury that one man inspired slaughter by sheer force of personality. You have a dramatic legal theory. That theory reads well in a book jacket and plays well on late-night TV. Third, the omission. The official version sweeps under the carpet the networks that connected the family to the fringes of Los Angeles rock stars, producers, biker gangs, and the curious openness of some Hollywood figures to unconventional living arrangements. It sanitizes the complex, transactional nature of the family's survival, sex, drugs, theft, and favors exchanged with people who saw profit or novelty rather than menace. It leaves out the fact that Manson learned his techniques in prisons and institutions that taught him how to manipulate others as a survival skill. It ignores the long list of small cruelties that made him into someone who could be both charismatic and dangerous. To visualize the official story's construction, imagine 3 panels. Panel 1 is an instructive school mural. Simplified faces, a timeline with a single arrow from rejection to apocalypse. Panel 2 is a courtroom diorama, dramatic witness statements, forensic photographs, and the prosecutor's book on display. Panel 3 is the cultural echo chamber, movie posters, album covers, talk show screenshots. Each panel reinforces the other until skepticism is flattened by repetition. Who benefits from this simplification? Start with the obvious, the prosecutor. A neat narrative earns convictions, book deals, and fame. The media benefits because clear villains sell copy and ratings. Hollywood benefits because monster stories are highly marketable. Law enforcement gains an image of competence. Its institutions apprehended evil and produced justice. Most important, society benefits psychologically. A tidy story distributes culpability outward, onto a figure everyone can agree to hate, instead of inward, toward institutions that are harder and costlier to reform. Now, listen to how the official voices speak again, but this time notice the gaps between their claims and the archive. A line from a best-selling account. Manson wielded a power over his followers no one could resist. It is a confident sentence, cinematic and final. Yet when you open trial transcripts and later interviews, you find contradictions. Some followers said they went along out of fear. Others went along out of hunger, sex, or a search for belonging. Some testified later that they didn't fully comprehend Manson's supposed ideology. The neat sentence collapses when the messy, human testimonies reappear. And yet the official myth stuck. It stuck because people needed it to stick. It stuck because the 1960s were a chaotic mirror and the public demanded an explanation that preserved a sense of order. It stuck because a prosecutor with a best-selling book can make his framing into a kind of cultural law. Once repeated, it hardened into an archetype. crazed leader, brainwashed follower. In the next section, we begin to pry those joints open, starting with the most obvious mismatch people rarely mention. The fact that the man at the center of the myth never actually wielded a murder weapon himself. The first crack in the official story is a factual one so obvious it shocks when you repeat it aloud. Charles Manson did not physically stab, shoot, or strangle any of the victims at Tate or La Bianca. That sentence should change how you hear the whole narrative. You were taught a picture of a mastermind at the center of slaughter. The legal reality was different. He was convicted of conspiracy and instructed murder, not of wielding the knife. That distinction is not pedantic. It's a hinge. Start with the simplest scene, a courtroom. The prosecution builds a chain of command, connecting a charismatic speaker to violent acts performed by others. The camera loves that chain. But when you read the transcripts, a different cadence emerges. Hesitant testimonies, shifting memories, and phrases like, "I don't remember him ever saying those words," or "We did what we were told that night," phrases that imply confusion as much as coercion. The legal theory that tied Manson to the killings relied on proving a kind of moral authorship. To a jury, the vision of Manson as an author of violence made sense. To a careful historian, authorship must be shown rather than assumed. Then there is Helter Skelter, itself the phrase that became shorthand for motive. Bugliosi's book claims that Manson believed the Beatles' White Album contained coded instructions for an apocalyptic race war. It's a dramatic claim, and it translated powerfully into courtroom rhetoric. But examine the sources. Many family members later said they had never heard Manson frame his actions in apocalyptic race war terms before their arrests. Linda Kasabian, a key witness who cooperated with the prosecution, testified about events with remarkable candor. She did not say she had heard a consistent, developed helter-skelter doctrine. Susan Atkins, who participated in the killings, gave different motives at different times. The neat causation Beatles lyrics to race war to ritual murder starts to wobble under scrutiny. You learned another tidy detail. Manson's rage against the music industry allegedly led him to target a house once occupied by Terry Melcher, a producer who had rebuffed him. The image fixates on Hollywood rejection as a motive. But the timeline is awkward. Melcher had moved months earlier. The Cielo Drive house was occupied by Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Manson knew the address historically, but he knew Melcher was no longer living there. The decision to attack Cielo Drive, then, reads less like a direct revenge act and more like a symbolic strike and assault on glittering, exclusionary Hollywood unless you dig deeper. There are other anomalies as well. Take the way brainwashing entered the story. On TV, it looks like a hypnotic ritual. A leader sings a few words, and the followers transform into automatons. In reality, the family's dynamics were messy mixtures of affection, coercion, dependency, and practical exchange. Manson offered belonging to often left-behind young people. He supplied sex, community, and a narrative that made sense of their disorientation. Drugs, particularly LSD, were communal and omnipresent, and they blurred boundaries. Addiction, economic precarity, and promises of spiritual uplift created a brittle scaffold for obedience. Brainwashing as instant conversion is a narrative flourish, not a forensic indictment. Another striking contradiction sits in the timeline of Manson's ascent from small-time criminal to cult leader. He served long stretches in juvenile facilities and prisons. By age 32, he'd spent large portions of his life institutionalized. Officials described him as a model prisoner in some facilities adjusted well, they wrote. Yet after release, he reappears suddenly as a figure who can attract a following. The official narrative implies an almost supernatural shift. An illiterate ex-con becomes a font of hypnotic power overnight. A more plausible read is that prison taught him practical skills for survival and manipulation. How to read men, how to exploit routines, how to trade favors. The conversion comes not from sudden genius, but from a practiced accumulation of techniques honed in institutions meant to corral and correct. Now consider the social network around Manson, a map official accounts often erase. Spawn Ranch is memorialized as an isolated commune. In truth, it functioned like a node on a map that included musicians, drug dealers, bikers, and people in the entertainment industry. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys housed Manson and several family members for months. Terry Melcher entertained the idea of recording Manson. The Straight Satan's motorcycle gang traded protection for drugs. These connections were transactional and fragile. They show that Manson was not an island genius of evil. He was a social operator who traded influence, access, and sexual favors. That reduces the mythic grandeur but reveals a more socially accountable set of conditions. The official saga hinges on one uncomfortable idea, that an outcast man single-handedly produced a volcanic eruption of violence. But the archival record suggests a far more distributed causality. It points to a cycle of institutional harm. Juvenile systems that brutalized and then released youth unprepared for life. Prisons that taught survival techniques which could be weaponized. A drug culture that eroded boundaries. A music industry that flirted with deviance but scorned those who didn't control their own careers. And a media landscape eager for spectacle. The murders did not spring from a vacuum. They emerged at an intersection of social rot. Even the theatrical brutality of the killings hints at that institutional lineage. Victims were stabbed dozens of times, often beyond what was necessary to cause death. The spectacle was not efficient. It was performative ritualistic in a way that mimicked the violent corrections Manson himself had seen in institutions. The word pig, written in blood at the Tate House, echoes punitive slogans, like a macabre parody of a prisoner's graffito. That the violence mimicked institutional cruelty suggests it was not purely ideological gesture. It was a replication of violence built into Manson's experience. When family members later claimed confusion about the motives, their testimony was not simply denial. It reflected the fractured reality of group violence. Decisions made in the fog of drug use, in power dynamics shifting from day to day, with loyalties cracking and panic seeding improvisation. A conspiracy theory that requires perfect unity among participants doesn't fit the mess on the ground. The killings look less like an executed master plan and more like escalation. A group dynamic collapsing into performative, brutal acts when leadership felt threatened and members felt they had little to lose. All of these contradictions Manson's lack of direct physical violence, the shaky Helter Skelter motive, the misfired timeline about Hollywood rejection, the prison-to-cult skill transfer, and the transactional social network accumulate into a new, uncomfortable picture. It is not one of an omnipotent monster, but of a human ecosystem gone toxic. That is not a less frightening picture. If anything, it is more unsettling because it implicates systems rather than a single aberrant personality. You probably recognize the pattern from other episodes of Public Panic. Society manufactures a villain because it is easier than fixing institutions. The Manson myth provided a simple scapegoat that relieved an anxious public and absolved complex structures that done the shaping. It allowed millions to say, he was a monster. That explains it, without asking harder questions about how we raise children, how prisons operate, and how fame and exploitation of young people interact. As we close this sequence of fissures, a new question crystallizes. What would change if we stopped telling the tidy story? What institutional reforms would become imaginable if the narrative's focus shifted from the figure of the demon to the networks that made him legible and possible? The official myth closes the book. The record opens it. And when you open it, you begin to see that the story you learned is a frame useful for certain ends, but incomplete for anyone who wants to prevent similar violence in the future. The cracks are no longer small. They run through the whole edifice of the official tale. If myth required a seamstress, this is where you start to pull the thread and let the garment fall apart, revealing the patchwork beneath. He came out of places that taught him how to survive by breaking others. Imagine a scene at Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary in 1965. Dormitory chatter, the metallic clang of mess trays, men trading stories to pass the time. Manson listens. He records small rituals, a wink that opens a contraband cigarette trade, the pet name inmates called each other when they wanted favors, the way men swore allegiance after a shared smoke. He copies behavior that worked. He practices language that flatters and isolates. This is not a man inventing doctrine. This is a man assembling a toolkit honed by survival. Prison taught him how to read deprivation and to offer remedies that felt like salvation. When he stepped into the open world again, he did not swoop down like an alien prophet. He arrived as a practiced social operator with a repertoire. He could perform vulnerability and claim spiritual insight in the same breath. He could tell a pretty girl she was part of something special and then, a few paragraphs later, trade her favors to keep the gas tank full. Spawn Ranch wasn't the isolated cult compound people imagine. Visually, yes, dusty trailers, the slope of a dry canyon, horses milling in the background. But in practice it functioned like a crossroads. Film crews stopped by, bikers rubbed shoulders with session musicians, small-time hustlers knocked on the same doors as wannabe producers. It was porous. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys is not a footnote here. He is a living doorway. Picture a late-night house party in Beverly Hills. Laughter, the smell of hash, a guitar strummed badly in a dim living room. Manson walks in with two girls in tow. He is small but magnetic in a low-heat way. He can make strangers laugh and listen. Wilson offers a couch, and, for a time, the family has a place to sleep and food to eat. The arrangement is transactional, and curious Wilson is fascinated by the edge of life Manson offers. And Manson needs a beachhead in the world he pretends to critique. That exchange is not the origin of the murders, but it is a crucial backstage ledger entry. Favors, access, and the tacit sanction of famous names. Terry Melcher, too, enters like a cameo in a longer script. Manson had been to the Cielo Drive address in search of music deals. Years later, Melcher no longer lives there. But the address remained a symbol of the world that had opened doors for some while closing them on others. The official line that frames Melcher as the direct target is neat. The messy truth is that addresses and rejections accumulate into grievances that are part personal, part symbolic, and part performative. The attack on Cielo Drive becomes, in retrospect, both an act of rage and a grotesque, improvised theater. Look closer at the family's internal economy, and the picture gets more ordinary and more unsettling. Young women, many from middle-class backgrounds, arrived with minimal resources and maximal loneliness. Manson offered belonging. He offered a communal language that reframed their past failures as part of a new spiritual project. He offered sex and attention strategic reward and then asked for allegiance in return. When resources ran thin, theft replaced sermonizing, credit cards, cars, food from dumpster raids. The Straight Satan's motorcycle gang operated as an off-the-books security detail. In exchange, Manson traded drugs and favors. This is a network, not a myth. There are moments that should change the narrative you learned in school. Correctional officers described him as adjusted, not monstrous. Family members, later in court, testified not to being hypnotized by a supernatural will, but to feeling needed, frightened, high, and dependent, a messy mix of motivations that does not compress into brainwashing. Linda Kasabian, whose testimony would prove crucial, later spoke with the wearied candor of someone who had been both victim and participant. Her account reads like a ledger of compromises, not a transcript of indoctrination sessions. Manson's techniques were not ceremonies out of a cult handbook. They were everyday manipulations adapted from institutional life. He could mirror a woman's pain with uncanny timing, give her a name that felt sacred, then isolate her. That pattern repeats in prisons and reform schools where people survive by trading intimacy for protection. It is useful to picture him as a small-time pimp with a rhetorical gift, precisely because it removes the supernatural and replaces it with the social. A human figure operating within a system that provided motives, tools, and blind spots. Here is a scene that almost never appears in polished documentaries. A ramshackle living room at Spawn, late afternoon. Plates clatter. A young woman pins up a poster. Manson sits on an overturned crate, talking about Beatles songs as if reciting scripture. Someone brings up rent. Manson nods, offers comfort, and shifts the conversation to a plan that will buy them gas. It is banal, and banalities matter. The family survives on exchange, not revelation. Fame and ideology are accessories to a daily calculus of need. Understanding these backstage exchanges does not diminish the horror of the crimes. If anything, it deepens it. When you see violence as the end of a chain of exchanges, sexual, economic, performative, it implicates more than one person. It implicates a legal system that churned out trained predators, a culture that fetishized youth and novelty, and an industry that flirted with fringe figures until they became profitable spectacles. The question becomes less, what did he whisper? And more, what did our institutions teach him to do? By the time the cameras found Spawn Ranch, the machinery of reputation had already been turning for years. And that machinery had friends in high places, some of them paid in cash, some in sex, some in the comfortable ignorance that comes from glamorizing danger while delegating its consequences to the poor and the profane. The stage was set. The players were in place. The collapse would not be instantaneous. It would be an escalation you could trace back through small trades, furtive deals, and the slow corrosion of human decency. What happens next is the night that changed everything, and how that night was dressed, framed, and later sold tells us just as much as the acts themselves. Tension accumulates like distant thunder on the night of August 8, 1969. Small decisions line up like dominoes. Who will drive? Who will hold the flashlight? Who will stay in the car? In the ranch trailers, they pass the time with songs and cigarettes. A cigarette dropped or a slight look becomes the kindling of something far uglier. You can almost hear the sound design if this were a film. Radios muffled in the background, an engine idling, chewing in the mouths of teenagers who are more afraid than they will ever admit. They drive to 10050 Cielo Drive, a place that in daylight is a testament to Californian glamour, a blue pool, the light on glass, a household of privilege. At night it becomes a stage for an improvised atrocity. The men and women who enter the house do not carry a manifesto. They carry a series of small rationales and raw emotion, indebtedness to a leader, resentment at exclusion, a readiness to prove loyalty. The violence that follows is in many ways more performative than practical. Knife strokes and bullets leave marks that read like overcompensation, ritualized cruelty intended to shock, to send a message louder than murder alone. The kill team moves with the brittle certainty of a group that has rehearsed obedience more than ethics. They select rooms, divide tasks, and some of them falter. Linda Kasabian, in her later testimony, described being a passenger in the car outside. She was the one who left without committing the act of crux that would later break the prosecution's case open. To the world, the image would harden into Pied Piper leads children to slaughter. The reality on the ground was hemorrhaging with contradictions, panic, improvisation, substances, and terror. The ritual inscriptions, the words scrawled in blood, the staging of bodies function as grotesque props, borrowed from a lexicon of violence and institutional punishment Manson had known and internalized. The next night, a second scene unspools at the LaBianca home. This time, the targets are different in name but equivalent in symbolic weight. Ordinary people, a grocery store owner and his wife, murdered in a domestic space that should feel safe. The pattern repeats, breaking into a private life, performing violence as a statement. The brutality is intentional and theatrical. It reads as rage, but it also reads as mimicry of punishments Manson had seen in other institutions. In the public retelling, Helter Skelter is neat and consumable. Music becomes prophecy, prophecy becomes plan, plan becomes massacre. Yet the trial transcripts expose fissures. Witnesses contradict, recant, or recall different versions of the same conversation. Linda Kasabian's testimony is precise about what she saw and what she didn't. Some participants later say they were acting on orders. Others say they were following chaotic impulses in a drug-fogged moment. The law has its own pragmatic hunger. To convict, it needs coherence. The prosecution supplies it, consolidating diffuse motives into a single, consumable doctrine. The public accepts the story because it delivers closure. But closure is not truth. A close reading of the events suggests something less tidy. A group dynamic that tipped into violence when Manson's control felt threatened, when resources ran out, and when improvisation replaced orchestration. The rage that exploded was at once personal and symbolic, a response to a lifetime of being excluded, of being told, not for you, and to a culture that had embraced some of his trappings while discarding him. In its immediacy, the violence was petty and theatrical. In its consequence, it was epical. The aftermath produced seismic shifts. Television turned the trial into a serial drama. Film and music industries recoiled, then repackaged the shock for profit. Property values in Benedict Canyon sagged. Law enforcement seized a new mandate to police not just crime, but the blurry spaces where alternative life choices bred suspicion. The legal outcomes resonated, too. Conspiracy law flexed in ways that would influence prosecutions for decades. If you were arrested as an associate in a plot, you could be tried on ideas, not only actions. The Manson case became a legal precedent and a cultural cudgel. Beyond law and markets, the murders altered how a generation saw itself. Communes closed. Parents took back their children. Political rhetoric hardened. A brief, intoxicating season of experimentation, sex, drugs, free love was reframed as a gateway to chaos. That reframing was not organically inevitable, it was curated. The most damning part of the story is not only what happened in those 2 nights, but how those nights were narrated afterward. Still, amid the layers of spectacle and the rush to make meaning, some small human truths persisted and refused to be contained in the official narrative. Family members who testified against Manson later described confusion, coercion, fear, and survival strategies, not the execution of an ideologically consistent apocalypse. The violence did not spring from scripture. It sprang from a brittle ecology of exploitation, institutional training, and interpersonal coercion. It is worth pausing on that distinction because it changes the way we imagine prevention. If the cause is systemic, then the remedy is structural. If the cause is only individual madness, the remedy is moral condemnation and incarceration. The night at Cielo Drive and the LaBianca murders were horrific in themselves, but they were also the hinge on which a larger myth would turn. What followed was not just justice in court. It was an exercise in meaning-making, in the selection of details that fit the story the nation wanted to tell. That story would be polished, packaged, and then sold. The question is not only what the perpetrators did, but who then took the shards and made them into a reliquary. The next act in this drama is the work of that reliquary, the machine that turned facts into legend and legend into a national alibi. Every myth needs a manufacturer. In the case of Manson, the factory floor was crowded. Prosecutors with headlines to win, journalists with ratings to chase, filmmakers with an appetite for monsters, and an anxious public hungry for explanation. The apparatus of narrative assembled quickly, and each cog turned to the same end, a tidy villain, a triumphant law, and a story the nation could hold like a soothing blanket. Start with the prosecution. Vincent Bugliosi had a legal problem. his defendant had not physically carried out the murders. The solution was to make motive legible and catastrophic. Legal theories can be elegant. They can also be theatrical. By cultivating Helter Skelter as an overarching ideology, Bugliosi offered jurors a narrative that made Manson not only morally responsible, but architecturally culpable. He converted fuzzy group dynamics into a single needlepoint image of orchestration. The book he later wrote, Helter Skelter, did for the courtroom what a blockbuster trailer does for a film. It compressed complexity into a simple, sellable fear. The media then layered on the spectacle. Cover photos emphasized Manson's eyes wild, unblinking, and the camera loved the contrast between his unkempt body and the polished language of the courtroom. Television regurgitated the most salacious soundbites. Documentaries staged reenactments that implied hypnotic sessions and sleeper cult indoctrination. The word brainwashing moved from being a contested label to an intuitive explanation. Clips circulated of family members laughing or crying, edited to suggest transformation from innocence to monstrosity. Context was sacrificed for momentum. Contradictions were inconvenient. It's worth noting, editorial economy is not an accidental byproduct of deadlines. It is often the deliberate choice that amplifies a narrative. Hollywood had its role too. Films and dramatizations took the fragments of the case and refined them into visual shorthand. The director's eye loves an image, the ring of followers around a leader, the eerie communal singing, blood as a dramatic prop. What sells on screen is a compact architecture, leader, followers, ritual. Nuance is a poor visual sell. The entertainment industry that had once enabled boundary crossing now repackaged it as a warning tale, and it sold very well. Then there were the institutions that benefited indirectly. Law enforcement agencies, already under critique for COINTELPRO and other abuses, welcomed a new exemplar of counterculture violence that could justify increased surveillance. Suddenly, communes and anti-war organizations could be framed as potential threats. The emergent policy posture was simple: marginalize the margins, and you reduce risk. It was a politically expedient frame that required forgetting the ways those same institutions had contributed to the problem. Academia and psychiatric experts supplied a veneer of authority. Terms like psychopathic leader and cultic coercion entered public discourse, often used as blunt instruments rather than precise diagnoses. The popularization of those terms mattered. They provided a vocabulary that made the Manson story legible in broader contexts. Manson became shorthand in the media for any deviant charisma. The shorthand itself obscured structural culpability. Not every actor was cynical. Some journalists sought truth. Some filmmakers tried to capture texture. But the economic incentives favored simplification. A prosecutor with a bestseller. A network with a television rating. A studio with a return on investment. The incentives lined up in a way that rewarded the creation of a myth. There were deliberate choices that shaped the record. Evidence was foreground or background. Certain testimonies were amplified, others were buried. Helter Skelter, in particular, functioned like a legal puppet string. Once you accept it as motive, many disparate facts coagulate into sense. Without it, the story splinters. With it, you have a neat crime drama in 3 acts. That is why historical narratives are political acts. Selecting which gaps to fill is often as powerful as the facts themselves. The market followed the moral panic. Books, magazine covers, and TV specials proliferated. Every retelling honed the image of Manson as a leader with superhuman sway. His face, his laugh, his gestures entered popular iconography. Merchandise followed, grotesque, but profitable. What had been a sequence of crimes became a brand. Dark, saleable, and durable. The legal aftershocks were profound and less visible. Prosecutors learned a lesson in narrative. You can try the leader and the idea as well as the actors. Conspiracy law metastasized into a broader tool. Over the next decades, authorities would invoke similar logics in prosecutions ranging from organized crime to political protests. Manson's trial supplied a template. If you can show influence, you can extend liability. That expansion of legal imagination has consequences. It broadens the net of the chains of culpability that ran through juvenile institutions, through opportunistic producers who courted fringe figures, through a drug culture that enabled exploitation. Those threads frayed quietly from public view. The story that stuck was one that relieved a society from looking at itself. Manufacturing a myth is not always conspiratorial in the sense of a single cabal plotting together. Often it is the emergent result of many incentives aligning: legal, commercial, cultural. Each actor behaves rationally within those incentives. The outcome, however, is not neutral. It determines which reforms we imagine and which we evade. If the problem is a single monstrous figure, we lock him away. If the problem is institutional rot, we must do harder work. The narrative that sold best let us choose the easier option. After the smoke cleared and the cameras moved on, the myth retained power not simply as a cautionary tale, but as a legitimizing artifact. It justified reforms that punished individuals and expanded surveillance, without committing to the long, costly, and politically fraught task of addressing the systems that had produced a figure like Manson in the first place. Now, when you see his face in cultural references on album covers, in Netflix true crime specials, in late-night jokes, remember that image did not arrive pure. It was assembled, edited, sold, and resold. The manufacturing process stripped texture and redistributed blame in socially convenient ways. That realization does not exonerate those who broke the law. It does, however, change who we hold accountable and how we think about prevention. The next question is what a more honest narrative looks like. If we stop treating Manson as a one-off demon and start treating him as a symptom, what reforms become imaginable? Who must be asked to answer for the failures: prison officials, social workers, entertainment executives, journalists, prosecutors? The answer is uncomfortable. It asks more of institutions than of villains. And asking that of institutions is exactly what the culture that manufactured the myth is organized not to do. If you strip away the sensational covers, the dramatic courtroom photos, the paperback theology of Helter Skelter, an ordinary and unsettling human figure emerges. Charles Manson was not a metaphysical aberration. He was the late product of a series of institutions and social arrangements that, taken together, produced a man skilled at survival, skilled at exchange, and tragically prepared to exploit the vulnerabilities of a generation in flux. Picture him not on a stage of sermonizing charisma, but in a sequence of corridors and cells. Small rooms with fluorescent light. Night shifts at workhouses where instructions are given in a short, economy-toned voice. A teenager shuffled from home to foster house to juvenile hall, learning that the world responds to blunt force and to the ability to mimic its language. That background matters. It explains why his persuasive techniques read less like magic and more like tradecraft: repetition, reward, humiliation, and the promise of belonging. The lives Manson assembled around him were not uniformly damaged in the same way. Many of his followers were middle-class girls who had left home searching for meaning. Visualize them arriving at Spawn Ranch as you might visualize travelers stepping into a bus depot at 3 in the morning, anxious, awake, uncertain which direction to take. Manson offered a proposition reframed for the moment: family, shelter, sexual openness, and a narrative that turned personal dislocation into spiritual destiny. Those were pragmatic transactions as much as they were emotional conversions. This is crucial. His authority depended on structural conditions more than on mystical gifts. Prison taught him how systems speak to broken people. He learned how to name grievances and then supply rituals that made those grievances feel dignified. He traded songs, gleaned phrases from popular culture and prison manuals, and constructed a lexicon that felt both intimate and cosmic. When you hear the family singing in archive clips, listen for the rhythm of exchange, charms, promises, the small punishments and small rewards that glue a group together. The Spawn Ranch itself looked cinematic, but the reality was smaller. It was a set of ramshackle trailers and dust, where the acts of daily life, cooking, stealing, repairing, were also acts of social reproduction. The ranch was a nexus of informal economies. Dennis Wilson's hospitality wasn't a romantic anecdote. It was part of a network that connected Manson to capital and visibility. Producers who flirted with signing him were not the benevolent mentors of myth, but nodes in the same economy that made him visible. That visibility mattered. It allowed a small-time operator to seem like something grander. Hollywood's fringes lent glamour. Thrift store clothes and a borrowed microphone became props in a performance that needed little to convince those already longing to be seen. Manson's techniques involved predictable human things. Isolation, for example, is banal and effective. The family slept in proximity and were frequently moved. That constant motion eroded outside ties. Drugs played a role in softening boundaries and generating shared highs that faux solidarity mistaken for love. Sexual economies offered immediate intimacy and long-term leverage. And the threat of shame, you've been warned, you've been rescued, but you could lose it, kept members oscillating between gratitude and fear. None of these require supernatural charisma. They require a patient operator who knows where to press. We must also trace the long shadow of the carceral state. His years inside institutions were formative not because he learned theology, but because he learned language, hierarchy, and survival. Consider an everyday prison program that insists on self-improvement while producing regimented obedience. Consider inmates taught how to perform model behavior for parole boards. Manson's transformation into a leader mirrored the professionalization of manipulation that institutions celebrated as rehabilitation. That paradox is central. State institutions claim to make citizens less dangerous, but in practice they taught skills that could be repurposed in toxic social formations. At the same time, there were genuinely human qualities in his life that complicate simple judgments. He possessed charisma in the ordinary sense. The ability to tell a story that made sense on a difficult night, the knack for making a stranger laugh, the skill of playing guitar through a personal narrative. The family's early days contained mutual care, some tenderness, small acts of kindness that are easily lost in the headlines. Recognizing those moments does not excuse violence. It makes the whole account morally sterner. Human beings who commit atrocities are usually capable of both warmth and cruelty. The dissonance between these states is what makes the study of such figures most urgent and most unsettling. The Tate LaBianca killings, viewed through this lens, look less like the climax of a prophetic strategy and more like the tragic logic of a group under pressure. Manson was facing the erosion of his influence as members sought independence, as resources tightened, and as the group's internal economy teetered. The murders were an extreme attempt to reassert dominance and to produce a spectacle that might recode meaning for the members. The theatricality, the overkill, the staging of messages in blood was not metaphysical purity, but an act of social theater designed to shock, to bind, and possibly to confuse investigators and the public. The performance conveyed less about a coherent ideology than about a desperate need to be central again. Important to note, not all participants remembered the same script. Testimonies diverge. Some remembered Helter Skelter ramblings. Some remembered personal grudges. Others recall confusion and intoxication. That plurality is not a legal loophole to absolution. It is evidence that the murders could not be reduced to a tidy ideological diagram. There is another inconvenient truth. The instruments used to convict and condemn also helped produce what they later displayed. Prosecutors and media distilled the messy archive into digestible terror. But when you dissect the raw materials, parole files, correspondence, correctional reports, the family's small criminal acts, you find a pattern of institutional training, exploitation, and opportunism. The phenomenon was social and legal at once. An individual built by institutions committing crimes that institutions then used to justify more power. This persona, when the victims remain victims. Accountability is necessary, but seeing Manson as symptomatic rather than mythical opens the way to systemic remedies that might prevent similar assemblages from forming. If we insist he is exceptional, we leave the conditions that made him intact, ready to reproduce. Now consider what the nation did afterward to ensure the portrait stuck. The next step is a machinery that polished and fixed the image. And that machinery did not merely tell lies. It simplified, selected, and monetized. The result is a public memory that serves management rather than repair. The question becomes, who benefits when a monster is useful? That is not merely rhetorical. It directs us to the institutions that still shape lives. You will have learned a different kind of pattern here. You've been trained, perhaps, by film and by law to look for a singular villain. But the honest portrait requires a broader and more discomforting gaze. And that gaze should make us ask a harder question. If we remove the mask and do the harder civic work, what remedies are we willing to fund? What institutions are we prepared to change? The answers determine whether an honest portrait is merely an intellectual exercise or the first frame of policy that might, one day, matter. The image of Charles Manson did not arrive fully formed. It was manufactured, polished, and distributed across multiple cultural channels. Picture a factory floor where courtrooms, tabloid presses, Hollywood studios, and political offices operate like conveyor belts. Each one took parts of the messy record and filed them into shapes that were easiest to sell. Leader, cult, apocalypse. The cumulative product was durable because each sector had incentives to maintain the final image. Start with the courtroom. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi confronted a legal problem that demanded theatrical clarity. Manson's physical absence from the scenes of the murders meant that tying him to conspiracy required a motive that jurors could hold. Helter Skelter fulfilled that role. It was dramatic, coherent, and frightening. It let the prosecution string otherwise disconnected facts into a narrative that the human mind prefers. Cause, plan, execution. Bugliosi's book afterward did more than recount evidence. It curated and amplified themes that would cross over into popular imagination. The result, a legal narrative became a public myth. The media multiplied the effects. Reporters favored images that reduced ambiguity. A photograph of Manson with raw, staring eyes became an emblem. The same photograph appeared on magazine covers, in newsreels, and in precinct lobbies. Interview clips were edited for emphasis. The newsroom rhythm rewards certainty. Ambiguity hurts ratings, tidy arcs sell. So the press selected details that fit the villain template and discarded those that complicated it. Hollywood and the entertainment industry then translated terror into spectacle. Directors, screenwriters, and producers borrowed the image and reimagined it. In retellings, complexity was expensive. Motifs: the ring of followers, the leader's laugh, the blooded words became shorthand imagery. The film version of Manson is not responsible for the murders, but it amplifies the myth. Art refashions reality into consumable narratives, and those narratives reinforce public memory. But there is a more consequential apparatus, the legal and policing aftermath. The trial produced not only convictions, but precedents. Conspiracy law flexed outward. If influence could be prosecuted, then networks could be dismantled and surveilled. That has public safety rationales, but it also enables expansion of state power. After Manson, authorities found justification to view alternative communities as potential threats. The homegrown paranoia ushered in policies and practices that circled communities with scrutiny rather than support. Think of the institutional beneficiaries of the myth. Law enforcement gained a moral and political argument for broader investigatory powers. The media gained headlines for months on end. Authors and filmmakers gained projects that translated into profit. The political class gained a simple enemy that could be used rhetorically to explain complex social decay. Whoever benefits from a simplified story is unlikely to lobby for its complication. Simplification is a resource. The mechanisms that built the myth had predictable stages. First, selection. Editors and prosecutors selected evidence that fit the Helter Skelter frame. Second, amplification. Publishers, networks, and studios amplified the frame through books, specials, and dramas. Third, institutionalization. Educational materials, policing strategies, and policy narratives absorbed the frame and made it default. Fourth, merchandising and commodification. The image of Manson turned into a cultural commodity. T-shirts, documentaries, late-night segments, a certain tourist curiosity about crime sites. Each repetition hardened the story into a cultural artifact. There were personalities who built the machine. Bugliosi is central, but he was not alone. TV producers staged reenactments that simplified motive. Books prioritized the most legible explanations. Talk shows monetized spectacle. And the FBI, sensitive after COINTELPRO revelations, welcomed a new example that tied counterculture to violence. Institutions that had been on the defensive suddenly had a banner to wave. How did this reshaping affect victims and witnesses? It flattened them. The family members, many of whom were coerced, addicted, or functionally traumatized, became either monsters or victims in a binary narrative. Their internal conflicts and survival strategies evaporated under the weight of the public myth. When we convert human complexity into a monster archetype, we erase the context that might instruct prevention. The propaganda machine was not uniformly conspiratorial. It functioned because actors acted rationally within structures that rewarded certainty and profit. But the effect was the same. Nuance was a casualty. The national story became a pressure valve for guilt avoidance. If one man is wholly monstrous, then systemic culpability is off the hook. Take a scene to visualize the outcome. Return to that courtroom image. The cameras flash. Manson's eyes are repeated across screens worldwide. The audience consumes horror as entertainment. Meanwhile, budgets that might have gone to juvenile care, to prison reform, or to community outreach remain politically unpopular. The spectacle diverts attention and resources, and the cost is deferred. The factory wins by design. It creates a market, supplies a product, and deflects responsibility. Over decades, the myth ossified and metastasized. The phrase Manson turned into an idiom. It is shorthand for irresistible evil. It gets invoked in political speeches, in commentaries about lonely men who commit mass violence, in caricatures about cultish devotion. That shorthand has consequences. It narrows our categories for understanding alienation and violence, arresting policy debate before it starts. Media revival cycles renewed the myth for new generations. Each new documentary or dramatized account re-centers the image and recolors it for contemporary anxieties. Streaming platforms have discovered that true crime engages audiences intensely. They repackage the case for binge consumption, often with production values that once again favor drama over context. The economic logic persists. Stories that frighten and titillate are profitable. The final twist in the propaganda arc is the way the myth functions as moral rehearsal. It allows viewers to experience horror safely at a distance. It trains citizens to locate evil in a face rather than in systems. That is psychologically useful and politically expedient. It questions very little about prisons, about celebrity economies, or about the social nets that failed both perpetrators and victims. If you look now at how the criminal justice system handles conspiracy, or how surveillance priorities get set, you can trace a lineage to the Manson moment. If you scan social media commentary after a mass atrocity and see the rush to name an archetypal villain, you observe a pattern the myth seeded. The machinery succeeded because it offered cognitive shortcuts at scale. There are costs beyond policy. The commercialization of tragedy erodes dignity. When a face becomes a brand, the human remains unmoored. Families are re-traumatized. Communities become tourist sites. The ethics of storytelling take a hit when grief turns into content. Yet you have seen the arc, a shocking scene, a tidy myth, cracks in the story, the backstage logistics, an atrocity that made history, and then the mill that turned all of it into a consumable legend. The final question is simple and heavy. When a society can convert a traumatized, institutionalized human being into an enduring symbol that shields its own failures, what else are we willing to hide behind our monsters? If you stayed with this investigation to the end, thank you. If you want more episodes that pull at the seams of accepted histories, subscribe and join the conversation below. Tell us where you learned your version of this story and what you think was left out. Leave a comment with your city or country. Your note helps us map how these myths travel. This dossier is only one file in a larger archive. There are more stories waiting to be opened, other legends wearing the same machine's fingerprints. What should we unmask next?